My name is Elaine Mercer. I'm 66. The morning began like any other quiet, slow, the kind of silence that comes when you've lived long enough to treasure it. I'd just poured my second cup of Earl Grey, the one I usually take out to the porch, to watch the light crawl over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The kettle still hissed softly when the front door slammed hard enough to shake the picture frames. Mark didn't knock anymore. He came in with the same stormy expression he'd worn since the day his father died. Impatience mixed with something colder. "We need to talk," he said, holding a thick envelope. His tie was half undone, his hair slicked back like he'd come straight from the office. I'd seen that look before, the one people wear when they've already decided what you'll say doesn't matter. I set my cup down. "What is it?" He dropped the envelope on the kitchen table. "You have 48 hours to move out." His voice was steady, rehearsed. "The house is mine now. I've signed everything over." For a moment, I couldn't tell if I'd heard him right. The words seemed to hang there, floating between us until they finally landed like a hammer. "This house," I said slowly. "Your father and I built every inch of it." He cut me off. "And you both made sure my name was on the refinance years ago. You said it was to make things easier when you got older. Well, that time's here." The air left the room. My fingers brushed the edge of the table, feeling the groove where his father once carved his initials. My voice came out smaller than I expected. "You're asking your own mother to leave her home. I'm not asking." He turned away, already heading for the door. "It's done." The door clicked shut, leaving the house unnervingly still. I stood there staring at the space he'd filled only seconds ago. The tea had gone cold. I didn't cry. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the garden I'd tended for 30 years. The sunlight spilled across the porch steps, and for the first time in my life, it didn't look like home. I rinsed the cup, set it upside down in the sink, and whispered, 48 hours. The quiet after Mark's departure felt heavier than the argument that never happened. I walked through the hallway slowly, my hand brushing the wallpaper we'd chosen in 1988, faded blue roses, sun-bleached near the window, where light always fell strongest. This house had once been our dream. I could still see Richard's hands sanding the banister smell, the varnish that lingered for days after we refinished the floors. He'd whistle off-key while measuring boards, pretending he knew what he was doing. We laughed through every mistake. The kitchen door still bore a small dent where he'd dropped a hammer and cursed so loudly the neighbors heard. I never fixed it. It made the place human. When Richard passed, I kept everything as it was, not out of refusal to move on, but because it felt like part of him lived in each repair. Even the uneven shelves he built for Mark's childhood trophies still leaned slightly to the left. I dusted them that morning, unaware that my son had already decided those walls no longer belonged to me. In the living room, a photo of us at the Asheville County Fair leaned against the lamp. Mark was 5, chocolate smeared on his face, holding a toy airplane. Richard had one arm around him, one around me. I lifted the frame, tracing their faces with my thumb until my vision blurred. The house creaked softly, as if remembering with me. Outside, the wind moved through the old oak branches, carrying the smell of rain. I felt the ache settle deeper, something between love and loss, between what we built and what had already been taken. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the light from the window, and whispered to the room, "He's forgotten what this place means." The next morning, I drove downtown to the Buncombe County Records Office, the same brick building where Richard and I had signed our first mortgage almost 40 years ago. The woman at the front desk smiled politely as I explained what I needed, her expression softening when she saw the tremor in my hands. She typed something into her computer, then disappeared behind a row of filing cabinets. When she returned, she held a thin folder with my name printed neatly across the top, Elaine Mercer. "Property transfer dated last September," she said. "Looks like it was processed through a quit-claim deed." I didn't understand at first. "A transfer?" "Yes, ma'am. You relinquished ownership to your son, Mark Mercer." She slid the document across the counter. My name stared back at me, the loops of the letters, neat, familiar, but not mine. The signature looked practiced, deliberate, as if someone had studied how I wrote it. My knees weakened. I held the paper closer, tracing the ink with my finger. The woman's voice grew careful. The notary on file is a man named Timothy Vance. Works with your son's company according to our database. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My son hadn't just taken advantage of my trust he'd used, it shaped it into a weapon. Can I get a copy of this? I asked quietly. Of course. She slipped it into a manila envelope and handed it over with a sympathetic look. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a slap. I walked to my car, the envelope pressed against my chest, and sat there for a while, with the engine off. The traffic on College Street moved steadily, indifferent to the moment my life had just divided into before and after. I thought of the day I'd signed papers for that refinance, the day Mark promised. This will just make things easier, Mom. He hadn't been wrong, it had made things easier for him. The steering wheel felt rough under my palms. I gripped it tightly, staring at the courthouse steps through the windshield until my vision cleared. Then I whispered to myself, steady and low. He forged my name. That evening, I found myself sitting on the porch, the envelope from the courthouse still on my lap. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and wood smoke from somewhere down the street. Across the yard, the porch light flicked on at Mrs. Keaton's house. She'd been my neighbor for over 30 years, a widow like me, sharp-minded even in her 70s, and the kind of woman who noticed things without prying. When she saw me sitting there long after dark, she crossed the lawn, a cardigan draped over her shoulders. "Elaine, honey," she said softly, "you look like someone just stole your favorite book." I almost laughed at that. Instead, I handed her the manila envelope. She read the first page, her lips tightening. "He forged your name." I nodded. She let out a slow breath, folding the paper neatly. "You need to see a lawyer first thing tomorrow, and don't you dare face this alone." Then she hesitated, her tone turning gentler. "You know, I remember Richard saying something once. Back when he was fixing your roof and joked he'd never finish it before retirement. He told me, I left Elaine something just in case she ever needs to start again. Do you know what he meant by that?" I shook my head, the memory tugging at me. Richard had always been cautious, the kind of man who planned for storms, even in sunny weather. Mrs. Keaton reached out and squeezed my hand. "Then maybe it's time to look where he'd want you to." When she left, the porch light from her house spilled across mine, steady and warm against the dark. I didn't sleep that night. Mrs. Keaton's words kept circling in my mind, wrapping around a memory I couldn't quite place. Richard had always been deliberate, never careless with money, never careless with love. I left Elaine something he'd said. The phrase echoed like a whisper from a locked room. At dawn, I went to the attic. Dust clung to everything, the boxes of Mark's school papers, old curtains, Christmas ornaments still smelling faintly of pine. Near the back, beneath a stack of photo albums, I found a wooden box I hadn't touched since Richard's funeral. The latch was stiff, but it opened with a small sigh. Inside were letters, receipts, and one envelope sealed in beige paper. Across the front, written in Richard's steady handwriting, were the words, "For Elaine, if you ever need to begin again." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single folded note and a few documents from the Asheville Community Credit Union. The note read, "Use this when kindness turns cruel. It's not much, but it's yours untouched. I trust you'll know when the time has come." I pressed the paper to my chest. The air felt thinner, lighter somehow, like the house itself had exhaled with me. The account number and balance were there, enough for a lawyer, enough for a start. Modest by any measure, but to me, it felt like a lifeline cast from the past. Richard had known life could turn unfair. He'd seen how easily trust could be broken. I spent the rest of the morning at the small credit union downtown. The teller verified everything with a quiet efficiency that felt almost sacred. When she handed me the new account card, I felt steadier than I had in days. Driving home, I glanced at the mountains rising beyond town blue and calm against the horizon. The betrayal still burned, but beneath it, something else began to take shape. Not revenge, but resolve. Leah Porter's office sat above a florist on Lexington Avenue, its windows filled with light and the faint scent of roses drifting in from below. I'd found her through a recommendation from Mrs. Keaton's friend who'd once sold her a house years ago. Leah looked younger than I expected, mid-40s, sharp eyes, calm voice, but something in her presence made me trust her before we even began. She listened as I laid everything out, the forged deed, the notary's name, the envelope from the courthouse. She didn't interrupt, only took notes in neat, angled handwriting. When I finished, she leaned back and tapped her pen once against the desk. "This is fraud, Mrs. Mercer," she said plainly. "A felony, in fact. The notary's involvement makes it worse. But the good news is we can act fast. If I file for an injunction today, the property will be frozen before he can sell, lease, or transfer it again." The word fraud landed like a stone in my stomach. I'd expected anger, maybe pity, but not the blunt certainty of law. "I don't want to destroy his life," I murmured. "He's still my son." Leah's tone softened, but not her resolve. "That doesn't make it right." "Protecting yourself isn't vengeance, it's survival." Her words settled in like truth I'd been avoiding. I watched her draft the first page of the petition, my name written clearly at the top. The same name he'd stolen, now reclaimed in ink that was finally my own. She explained the process: an emergency filing, a notary verification request, a formal complaint against the county's records division. Each step sounded clinical, but every sentence felt like a slow stitching of something torn. Before I left, Leah handed me a folder with copies of the documents and her card clipped to the front. "You'll get notice within 48 hours, she said. "Until then, don't contact him. Let the law do the talking." Outside, the afternoon light fell gold across the street, warming the stone buildings of downtown Asheville. I paused beside the florist below her office, the air thick with lavender and earth. For the first time in days, I felt my breath deepen. Justice, I realized, didn't roar. It moved quietly, steady as a pen across paper. I began packing that same night. Not in a rush or panic, but methodically, like someone preparing for a long winter. The house was still under the injunction, but I wanted to be gone before Mark came back. There was no satisfaction in confrontation, only the quiet satisfaction of finishing what needed to be done. I moved from room to room, folding clothes into 2 suitcases, wrapping framed photographs in towels, labeling boxes with a black marker. The sound of tape stretching across cardboard echoed softly, steady and certain. I took only what was mine, the books Richard had given me, his old wristwatch, the quilt we'd sewn the year Mark went to college. The rest I left untouched. By morning, I'd arranged for a small moving truck from a local company. 2 young men showed up just after sunrise, polite and efficient. They didn't ask questions when I told them to take everything to a storage unit on Merriman Avenue. Within hours, the living room stood bare, the walls pale where paintings had once hung. Before leaving, I called the electric and water companies, canceled the services, and forwarded my mail to a post office box downtown. The motions felt strange, almost mechanical, but each small task lightened something inside me. When the movers drove off, I locked the front door and stood on the porch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard Richard had once mowed every Sunday. I reached for the switch by the door and turned on the porch light. Its glow fell soft against the steps, warm against the fading day. "You'll have your house." I whispered the words barely louder than a breath. Empty. Then I walked down the path without looking back. Mark arrived 2 days later, his car pulling into the gravel driveway with the kind of confidence only ownership gives. From the window of her house across the street, Mrs. Keaton later told me he looked impatient, glancing at his phone as if he already had plans for the evening. His wife stepped out a moment later, adjusting her sunglasses, her voice carrying sharp and bright through the quiet air. But the moment they reached the porch, everything shifted. The curtains were gone, the furniture missing. Through the front window, the house looked hollow, walls, bare floors gleaming where rugs had once softened the steps, and taped to the front door, held by a strip of blue painter's tape, was a single white notice, property, under legal injunction, do not enter. Mark froze. His wife leaned closer to read it, her expression twisting from confusion to disbelief. "What does that mean?" she asked. He didn't answer. His hand hovered near the handle but didn't touch it. The locks had been changed. The keys in his pocket suddenly meant nothing. Neighbors began to watch from their porches, pretending not to. A breeze lifted the edges of the notice, fluttering it against the door like a whisper. Mark crumpled the corner of the paper in his hand, then let it go, stepping back, as if the house itself had turned against him. His wife said something low, angry, but he only shook his head. For the first time, he looked uncertain, small against the house he'd tried to claim. He turned, got back into the car, and drove away without another word. The porch light stayed on steady and unblinking behind him. The following week, Leah called to say Mark had agreed to meet at her office. I almost didn't go. A part of me wanted to let the silence speak for itself, but Leah insisted closure mattered. When I arrived, Mark was already there, sitting stiffly in the chair across from her desk. He looked older, tired, in a way I hadn't seen before. He didn't look at me when I sat down. "Mom," he began, voice low, "this whole thing got out of hand. It was never supposed to go this far. I was under pressure, my job, the mortgage, everything piling up. I thought I could fix it before you even noticed." Leah's expression didn't change. She slid a folder across the table, the evidence stacked neatly inside. "Forgery isn't a misunderstanding," she said evenly. Mark's shoulders tensed. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he muttered. "It was just family business." I leaned forward. "A lie signed in ink isn't family business," I said quietly. "It's theft." He looked at me, then eyes flickering with shame, or maybe anger, it was hard to tell. I could see the boy he once was, the one who'd scraped his knees in the same yard he'd tried to take from me. Leah outlined the options: admit guilt, sign the restitution agreement, or face formal charges. The pen lay between us, waiting. Mark's hand hovered, then dropped. He said nothing. That silence was enough. I signed my part, stood, and left without looking back. The sound of my heels on the tile felt like a heartbeat, finally finding its rhythm again. Months passed quietly after the meeting. The house on Maple Street was no longer mine, but I no longer wanted it to be. Leah handled the final paperwork, and with what remained from Richard's account, I found a small cottage tucked against the edge of the Blue Ridge. It wasn't large, but it had a view of the valley that changed colors with every hour of sunlight. I began volunteering at the town library on Main Street 3 afternoons a week, sorting books and helping children find stories that made their faces light up. It was simple work, but it filled the days with something steady, something clean. Mrs. Keaton visited often, bringing jars of jam and updates about the neighborhood. She never asked about Mark, and I never offered. Some silences are best left as they are. One evening, as dusk deepened and the hills turned violet, I stepped outside with a mug of tea. The porch light hung above me, a small, warm circle against the growing dark. For years I had turned on such a light, waiting for someone to come home. Now, as the wind moved gently through the trees, I reached for the switch and whispered, "This light's for me." The bulb glowed softly, steady and golden, holding its quiet place against the night.